If your crochet projects are looking more like this and less like this, stick around. I'm going to be talking about the most common crochet mistakes and how to fix them. So grab your crochet stuff and let's get started. So the goal for today is to learn how to crochet squares like these with straight edges, the top the same size as the bottom of the work, and nice consistent stitches that aren't too tight and aren't too loose. If you're the type of crocheter that gets super frustrated because your project is not looking the way that it's supposed to, I totally understand. There are a ton of crocheters who have similar struggles, whether that be super tight stitches, uneven edges, the top of your work is much smaller than the bottom of your work, you name it. We are going to walk through all of those different struggles and how to fix them. The number one mistake I see crocheters making is crocheting too tight. So let's work through chains here so I can show you exactly what I mean. As you can see, my slip knot is pretty tight to begin with. I'm having trouble pulling my hook through the yarn, and whenever I try to go back into that chain, it's difficult to see and even more difficult to push my hook through. So to fix this problem, we're going to start from the beginning, make sure our slip knot is not touching our hook, that our hook can move freely. And when we yarn over, I like to hold my work and glide it through, pull up my hook for the next one just a little bit. At all times, your yarn and your hook should be able to move freely. If you're having trouble moving everything, it's too tight. Now when I try to go back into those chains, it is super easy to see and to push my hook through. Let's practice with single crochet stitches. I'll insert my hook and pull up a loop. Those two loops on my hook should be able to move easily, and they should also be about the same size before yarning over and finishing up the stitch. So let's do that again. I'll insert into the chain, yarn over, pull up a loop, making sure those aren't too tight and are the same size, and then yarn over and pull through. Now let me show you what it looks like if they are not the same size. So if you insert your hook and you pull up a loop and it's super tight, it's going to be smaller than the second loop on your hook and harder to pull through, and it makes a much tighter stitch. Another thing that affects your tension is how you hold your yarn and your hook. So one thing you can try is switching up the ways that you do those things to make sure you're using the way that's most comfortable for you. So when holding your yarn, the most common ways are wrapping around your index finger. Some people like to wrap the yarn around their pinky finger and then run it over their fingers. Personally, I like to place it between my middle and index finger. There are a lot of different ways that you can hold the yarn. There isn't a wrong way, but just make sure the way you're doing it actually makes sense for you. Now for holding the hook, I hold it like a knife, like if you were cutting a steak. Some people like to hold it like a pencil, like this, where they insert the hook and they hold it like they would if they were writing. Personally, my tension's loose when I do it that way, so when I hold it like a knife, I find using my pointer finger to guide the hook is much easier for me. So be sure to try several different ways and make sure that it's comfortable. Reason number 2 your crochet is not turning out is you're putting your hook in the wrong place. So let's talk about stitches, what they look like, how to count them, and where to put your hook. So the best way to do that is by looking at it from the top. And if you turn your work to the side, you can see each stitch looks like a V. I know it's hard to see from certain angles, but if you turn it this way, those stitches should be pretty easy to count. Now, one thing you want to be careful of is not counting your turning chain as a stitch. So it does look a bit like the stitches from the top. So whenever you chain one, be sure not to count that as a stitch. And your very first stitch is going to be in that next V. From the front, it looks like this. It's going to be that first space. I'm going to place my hook there to do my first single crochet, making sure those loops are nice and even. And then the next one is going to be under that next V. Now, some people make the mistake of putting it under one strand of yarn, and you need it to be under both strands of yarn for a typical traditional crochet stitch. Some stitches will say in the front loop only, or in the back loop only, but if it doesn't say that, you definitely want it to be under both stitches. Counting stitches from the front is a little trickier, but you'll see a little sideways piece of yarn and then 2 little legs. And that's what a single crochet stitch looks like from the front if you want to count them that way. But mostly I like to count them from the top, just making sure I've got those 2 strands of yarn over my hook whenever I'm yarning over. Reason number 3 your crochet projects aren't turning out is that you are dropping and adding stitches by accident. So now that you know how to count your stitches, that will certainly help, but there are some other things you can do as well. If your work is looking a bit like a trapezoid where the top of your work is bigger or smaller than the bottom, it's probably because you're dropping and adding stitches. So we'll start a new row here, and I'm going to use stitch markers so that I can see where the beginning and the end of my row ends easily. So if you don't have stitch markers, you can use a bobby pin, a safety pin, or even a different color yarn. So I'm going to place my first stitch here and then grab a stitch marker and put it in my first stitch. Now I will easily be able to see where my row begins, and I will continue the rest of my row here to the end. And I would start using these stitch markers even on your very first row. It makes it so much easier to be able to see that last and first stitch, which are the hardest to pick out. So now that I'm on my last stitch here, I'll do a single crochet and place my stitch marker. And now I should have one at the beginning and one at the end. And now I will chain 1 and turn. And when I turn, it's so easy now to see where I'm supposed to place my first stitch and where I'm supposed to place my last stitch. Along with counting your stitches, this will just make it double, triple guaranteed that you're not accidentally adding or taking any out by accident. Reason number 4 is turning your work incorrectly. So when you get to the end of the row, if you're not sure what to do, maybe you're just guessing how many chains you need to have, here I'm going to give you a basic rule of thumb, and that's going to help a lot whenever you're using these foundational crochet stitches. So first I'm going to take out my stitch marker here that marked the end of my row and place my last single crochet. And you do turning chains based on the height of your stitches. So for things like slip stitch or single crochet, they are relatively short stitches. So I will use 1 turning chain. And for higher stitches, you would use more turning chains. So for this one, I'll do chain 1. But say, for example, it was a double crochet or a half double crochet, you would chain 2 and turn. For treble crochet, you would chain 3 and turn. And there are some techniques that use different numbers of chains for turning, but this is the most common and basic rule of thumb for those foundational crochet stitches. So for single crochet, you're always going to chain 1 and turn your work, making sure not to count it as a stitch. You also want to be sure that your chains aren't too loose. Otherwise, when you work into your next stitch, you'll have this little bump that sticks out. So don't forget about your tension even with chaining. Last but not least, reason number 5 is not finishing your project correctly. I have been guilty of knotting my yarn and then snipping off and hoping for the best. This is not a good idea. Your work will unravel and it will make you really sad with all the time that you spent, and then the first time you put it in the washing machine, it all comes apart. I've also tried snipping it off and super gluing, which makes it last a little longer, but not much. So you really want to use a sewing needle or a small crochet hook to weave those ends in so that they don't pop out and you don't have any unraveling. So to do that, I'm going to use this large sewing needle, and I am going to weave my end through the rows in one direction. And then I turn and go in the other direction. And this really helps ensure that those ends don't pop out later. And if you do this thoroughly, it will make your crochet projects last so much longer and look a lot more professional. And when you're done, then you can snip off the excess. If your work's curling up a bit on the sides, that's totally okay and normal. If it was curling up or rolling up a lot or bunching, then you would have a tension problem and would probably want to size up your hook or just work a little looser. But for just a little bit of rolling edges like this, I love to do blocking of my crochet projects. Now to do that, I use a foam blocking board. I got this at the craft store. You could also pin it to a bed or another surface. I use starch for my projects that I want to be stiffer. So say this was going to be a coaster. Starch is great. It will make it maintain its shape for longer. You could also use water or fabric softener depending on the look that you're going for. I just lightly spray it till it's damp and then pin it down to the board in the shape that I want it to be and let it dry. Sometimes I will wash the project and then block it, which is also a good way to finish up your projects and make them look really nice and professional. It makes your stitches distribute correctly and lay correctly. This is an absolute game changer. I highly recommend that you check out my washcloth tutorial for beginners. It covers all these concepts and more. Until next time, happy crocheting!